St. Thomas Aquinas follows Aristotle in saying that virtue is the mean between the extremes. The virtue is in the middle, and we can err in one of two ways. We can err in defect, or we can err in excess. And the readings this week talk about this virtue of humility. And so I want to spend some time talking about those two ways that we can err with humility, and then give a few examples of people who lived that virtue well. So humility is the foundation of all the virtues. So we need to make sure that we know about it, that we're practicing it, that we are trying to acquire it, because if we don't, we can't acquire any of the other virtues. And so humility errs in excess. Whenever it errs in excess, it turns into self-loathing. Right? Someone who thinks that they are completely wretched, they can't do anything right, they're terrible at everything, and there's nothing that anyone can do to get them over that, not even God himself. Right? This is obviously not the case, because if we look at creation, right, God is the one who brings all things into existence. God brought things into existence in the beginning, and if we read about that, we hear the scriptures say that God created. When he saw what he created, he said, it was good. And so if God says it was good about the water and about the sky and about all the various animals that run around the earth or swim in the ocean, then certainly this has to be true about the crown of creation, right? Human beings. That we are created good. That God looks at us and sees that we are good because we're created in his image and likeness. And so we fail to see that, and we can fall into this self-loathing at times and not have that virtue of humility. The other way that humility goes astray is by being prideful. Right? That is the defect of the virtue of humility. One is proud. That vice of pride means that we think too highly of ourselves. Again, St. Thomas says that pride is going for that which is beyond our ability. Pride is thinking or tending to too high of things immoderately. And this is the sin of Adam and Eve. Right? They saw what they wanted and they tried to grasp for it rather than receiving from the Lord what he wanted to give. And so that virtue, or it's not a virtue, that vice of pride, maybe I want it to be a virtue sometime, that vice of pride is an excessive desire for one's own excellence. Right? The true virtue of humility recognizes goodness but gives the credit to God. Pride recognizes goodness but takes the credit for oneself. And so it goes against the entire goal of the spiritual life, which is the glory of God. Right? We need to give God recognition for the good that is done. And so, as I mentioned, the readings, especially the gospel, speak about this virtue of humility and sort of spur us on to it. And Father Roger Landry, who some of you may know, in reflecting on this gospel, says this, that this gospel is sort of a summary of the entire message of the gospel. And that summary is that we ought to never forget where we came from, and we have to remember the greatness that a relationship with God confers on us. Never forget where we came from. Don't become proud. But also never forget the greatness that we're called to and the greatness that a relationship with God confers on us. Never fall into that self-loathing. And so I'm going to give you briefly three examples of saints who lived this virtue well, and in their own way sort of show a different aspect or a dimension of that one virtue of humility. So the first is St. Monica. St. Monica was the mother of St. Augustine, and we celebrated her feast day yesterday, so she was fresh in my mind. And Monica prayed unceasingly for St. Augustine's conversion. St. Augustine was sort of a heathen growing up, and he explored a lot of different avenues to try to obtain happiness. And Monica had to watch this and sort of suffer as she watched him do this. And so she would pray for him. And she would go and bother the bishop, St. Ambrose, often, asking him to talk to her son. And finally, Ambrose looked at her one day and said, "Go away and don't come back. There's no way that a child of this much prayer will go unsaved." He wasn't being harsh with her. He was trying to set her at ease, and he did. She went away. She continued to pray, but she trusted that God would do the work. And so Monica shows us this virtue of humility in respect to our prayer, that we have to pray diligently. We have to pray constantly. But we have to pray knowing that it's God who's going to bring about the change or the grace or the miracle, whatever it might be. Right? I am not the one that is going to convert anyone. I'm going to pray and trust that God is going to do it. And so she shows us how to have a sort of detachment in prayer, right? Or what they would call a holy indifference. Right? I pray and I trust that God will do whatever is best. The second example of that virtue of humility lived well is St. Augustine. So St. Augustine's feast day is today. And so again, he was fresh in my mind. And Augustine said that the three most important things about living a good Christian life are humility, humility, humility. If we don't have humility, we can't do anything. We have to have that virtue of humility. And this is even more impressive coming from St. Augustine, because St. Augustine was one of the greatest minds that the world has ever seen. He wrote volumes and volumes on what it means when we say we believe in God, and sort of fleshing out the theology of the church in the early church. He wrote so much, in fact, that people say that if anyone tells you that they've read all of Augustine, they're lying, because he wrote too much for them to read it all. And he was incredibly gifted, and yet he still had this virtue of humility. And his sort of display of humility comes about in a couple of ways. One, in the fact that he converted, right? That he was not too proud to, whenever he found the truth in the Catholic faith, to say, this is it, and to submit himself to the teachings of the church, and to be baptized. But also, I think it's on display most beautifully in his writing of the Confessions. So he writes the Confessions, and it's not so much confession in the sense that we think about, right? He's not sitting there writing out all of his sins so that everybody knows, but he's writing the Confessions as a confession of faith, right? Proclaiming his faith in God and giving thanks to God for the good that he was able to do through him. And so Augustine, again, had this sort of intellectual humility to be able to seek the truth and not try to impose what he wanted to say was true on whatever he found. Right? He received from God the truth that he sought out. Then the third example of a life lived in humility is the best example after Jesus, and that is the example of Mary. Right? Mary, who undoes the sin of Adam, right? Adam and Eve, who reached out for what they wanted. Well, Mary shows us the exact opposite. Right? Mary is that humble servant who receives the gift of the Lord. She receives Gabriel into her presence. She receives the call that God gives her. And so she shows us that virtue on humility in display in the most beautiful way. And this doesn't mean, again, that she denies good, that she denies that she was doing good things. In fact, she proclaims it. Right? In the Magnificat, we pray this every night for evening prayer. My soul proclaims the greatness of the Lord. Only someone who's truly humble can say that. That my soul proclaims the greatness of the Lord. And she's able to say that in all humility because of a few lines later, she says, because he has looked with favor on his lowly servant. Mary recognizes that she is a lowly servant, and that the greatness that is done through her and the proclaiming of the greatness of God done in her soul is because of God's gift to her, right? Because she is full of grace, because she is full of the goodness of the Lord. And so Monica, Augustine, and Mary show us what humility looks like. Right? They show us how to live in that mean between the extremes, not falling into self-loathing, not falling into pride, but living that virtue of humility. Right? They show us what it's like to never forget where we came from, right? That we are sinners in need of God's mercy, but also never to forget the greatness that a relationship with God calls us to and confers on us. They show us what it's like, as we heard in the gospel, right, to take the lowest seat, to assign ourselves to the lowest seat, and then to allow God, the great host of the wedding feast, to approach us and to call us up to a higher place.